She thought owning a cabin by the lake would mean peace. But peace doesn't exist when the HOA believes certain people don't belong. One evening, the door slammed open. Papers waved in the air, voices dripping with false authority. "Pack your things. This land isn't meant for you." The notice was fake. The anger was real, and the prejudice behind it was unmistakable. But what they didn't know was that someone powerful was watching. Someone who could expose every lie. What happens when racism hides behind HOA rules? Stay with me. The truth will leave you speechless. Like and subscribe to join our community. For years, the lake cabin had been my sanctuary. It wasn't just wood and stone. It was family history. My grandfather built it with his own hands. My parents raised me on its porch summers, and now it was the one place I could breathe freely away from the noise of the city. To me, it was more than a vacation spot. It was home. Life at the cabin was simple. Mornings with coffee on the dock, afternoons fixing the old boards, and evenings listening to the water lap against the shore. But beneath that peace, there was always a shadow I couldn't ignore. The local HOA had been watching me for months. Their notices tucked into my mailbox grew more ridiculous each week. Complaints about my mailbox not matching community standards, warnings about the color of my shutters, even fines for having non-compliant landscaping. At first, I brushed it off as small-town politics. Every neighborhood has a Karen or two, always looking for control. But this was different. Their language wasn't just about rules, it was about me, about who I was, about what they thought I represented. The words "people like you" had been whispered more than once at board meetings, sharp enough to cut even through the polite smiles. Still, I kept quiet, hoping it would blow over. After all, what could they really do? This was my land, my family's cabin. But deep down, I felt the storm building. And on that night, when the door slammed open and their lies spilled into my living room, I realized this wasn't just about HOA rules. It was about prejudice, power, and the lengths some people will go to erase a history they don't think belongs. The signs of trouble began quietly, almost like whispers carried across the lake. At first, it was just small notices, folded neatly and slipped under my door. Violation, unauthorized mailbox design. Violation, lawn not trimmed to community standards. I laughed them off. Who gets fined for the length of grass in the woods? But each note grew sharper, more targeted, less about rules, and more about me. Soon, the whispers turned into meetings. The HOA board gathered in their polished clubhouse, whispering about how families like mine didn't match the community's standards. The coded words weren't subtle. They weren't talking about grass, paint, or shutters. They were talking about race. And no matter how many generations my family had owned that cabin, in their eyes I would always be an outsider. Then came the fake fines, a mandatory fee for using the dock my grandfather built, a notice claiming my cabin encroached on community property, and the cruelest one yet, a forged eviction threat that ordered me to vacate within 30 days. The letterhead was sloppy, the signature barely legible, but the message was clear. They wanted me gone. I thought about fighting it in silence, the way so many before me had been forced to. But something in me refused. That cabin wasn't just a house. It was history, legacy, and pride. Giving in would mean erasing everything my family had built. Still, the pressure grew heavier every day. Neighbors began avoiding me. The store clerk who once greeted me warmly now looked away. It felt like the board's prejudice was poisoning the whole town. And then Karen arrived. It was evening, the fire crackling in the cabin, when the door burst open without a knock. Karen stormed in, her voice sharp, her eyes blazing with arrogance. She slapped another notice down on my table. "This property isn't yours anymore," she hissed. "The HOA has decided it will be used for community purposes." Her voice dripped with power, but beneath it I could hear something else. Satisfaction. Like she believed she was finally putting me in my place. I didn't move. I didn't even flinch. Because sitting across from me at that very moment was the last person she expected to see, the state attorney general. Calm, collected, his presence filled the room like a silent storm. He raised his brow at her, adjusting his glasses, but didn't say a word. Yet, Karen, too busy barking threats, didn't even notice him. She paced, waving her flimsy notice like a sword, spewing HOA rules that didn't exist, making it sound as if the law was on her side. "Don't bother calling anyone," she sneered. "The law won't protect you." But she didn't. Realized she had just broken the first and biggest mistake of her life, threatening me in front of the one man who was the law. The Attorney General leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but heavy, the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to silence a room. "On your side?" he asked. Karen froze, finally noticing him. Her fake confidence wavered just for a second. And in that second I knew the game had just changed. Because this wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. It was about to become something much, much bigger. The silence after the Attorney General spoke was suffocating. Karen's smirk evaporated, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. But before she could stammer a reply, the cabin door creaked open again. In stepped the HOA president, an older man with polished shoes and the kind of confidence that came from years of unchecked power. "Good," he said, spotting Karen. "I see you've delivered the notice." He glanced at me with disdain, then at the Attorney General without recognition. "Now pack up your things. This cabin doesn't belong to you anymore." I felt my chest tighten. My home, my family's history, was being stripped from me in front of my own eyes. Every memory carved into those wooden walls was being reduced to a rule violation. And worst of all, they expected me to be silent, to bow my head, and disappear. Karen crossed her arms, emboldened again with backup. "You people never learn," she spat. "This community was never meant for you." The words hung in the air like poison. For a moment, rage threatened to take over. I wanted to shout, to throw them both out. But before I could speak, the Attorney General rose slowly from his chair. His presence filled the small cabin, commanding attention in a way neither Karen nor the president could ignore. "Never meant for who?" His voice was sharp, unflinching. The question cracked the room open like thunder. The president stuttered, Karen's eyes widened, and for the first time they realized the ground beneath them was collapsing. This wasn't just about HOA politics. They had exposed the ugly truth of their prejudice, and they had done it in front of the highest law officer in the state. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. This was the moment. The fight I never wanted had arrived, and it would decide not only my home, but whether justice would finally stand against racism in this community. And then, the Attorney General reached into his briefcase. The Attorney General's hand lingered on the briefcase for a moment before snapping it open. Papers spilled across the table, legal filings, evidence of discriminatory HOA practices, and letters of complaint from other families who had quietly suffered under the same rules. The room fell silent. Karen's face drained of color. The president's voice cracked as he tried to defend their actions, but the Attorney General cut him off with a single sentence. "This community has tolerated prejudice long enough. That ends today." In that instant, the weight I had been carrying for years seemed to lift. My cabin wasn't just saved, it was vindicated. It became a symbol that even in the face of arrogance, cruelty, and systemic bias, truth could still shine through. But the impact didn't stop with me. The Attorney General launched a full investigation into the HOA. Families who had once been too afraid to speak out came forward. Neighbors began looking at one another differently, not with suspicion, but with the realization that silence had allowed injustice to grow unchecked. And yet, even with this victory, I couldn't ignore the larger truth. The fact that Karen's words, "never meant for you," still echoed in so many corners of America. This wasn't just about a cabin or one community. It was about generations who had been told they didn't belong, who had been denied dignity simply because of who they were. That night, as I sat by the fireplace in my cabin, I realized this story wasn't mine alone. It belonged to anyone who has ever been made to feel less than. And if one act of courage could bring down years of injustice in one neighborhood, imagine what could happen if more of us refused to be silent. So I leave you with this. When you see injustice, will you look away or will you speak up? Because silence protects the oppressor. But courage can change everything. If this story touched you, don't just watch. Be part of the change. Hit subscribe and join our community of voices that matter.